evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Mahoning Drive-In Theater, the largest single-screen drive-in in the United States. We're certainly glad you could be with us this evening, and don't forget the concession stand is open with all kinds of great things to eat and drink.
Mahoning Drive-In Radio. Mark here for another exciting hour of fun chit-chatting about films and drive-ins and films that played at drive-ins and maybe drive-ins that appeared on film. I have a special guest with me today, close, as I joke around with Val, my close personal friend, legendary comic artist S.R. Bissette, which is just funny to say, and it is kind of true. So Steve Bissette is here with us.
It's all true.
It's all true. We've known each other for like a decade or so because I used to put on these silly, fun, retro, throwback 35 millimeter horror screenings in Keene, New Hampshire at the beautiful classic Colonial Theater where I used to live with a horror host show I used to do. And I contacted Steve, not because of his iconic status, but because he's a guy that I knew lived nearby who might want to come to the show. We were running the abominable Dr. Fives and 35 millimeter, and I had no idea that anybody would show up. So I'm like, I think this guy likes this movie. And it turned into this friendship where I'll give you the proper intro. So you may know Steve Bissette's work from the pages of Swamp Thing, Taboo, Tyrant, the book series that you have done, S.R. Bissette's Blur, collecting your film criticism or film writing, the multiple DVDs and Blu-ray commentaries that you've done and extras work, and on and on and on. I knew him as a guy who worked at a local video store. It was a really good video store. And later as a person who was involved with the Center for Cartoon Studies in White River Junction, Vermont, where you were a teacher for like a decade or so. And
15 years.
All of that came together. I knew you because you had written for Video Watchdog. You drew a comic book I loved when I was a kid, and you worked at a video store that I loved nearby. You came into the fold with these screenings that we were doing, and you brought the CCS gang in, which was fantastic because you had all these young, incredibly talented artists donating sketches for our raffles, and you donated sketches for the raffles, and everybody came to the show, and it was a total blast. So now our lives have gone where they've gone, and once again, the love of goofy old movies brings us together. That is probably the most rambling introduction you'll ever get.
No, that was the best intro ever, Mark. So.
It's a personal touch. So,
best intro ever. So.
Thank you. So you like drive-ins and I like drive-ins. And I wanted to sort of pick your brain about your drive-in history because I got into drive-ins at the tail end of when they were still semi-robust. This would have been mid-70s to early 80s. And then my local drive-in closed in 87, and I didn't really rediscover them until well into the 90s. And then that sort of led to where I am here. But you experienced drive-ins in what I think of as the heyday, or they showed the kind of movies that I'm desperate to see now in repertory, but they were first run for you. So yeah. What is your earliest memory of a drive-in?
That's a great question because I've been thinking about that, not because, you had contacted me, we were going to do this conversation, but because I recently rekindled contact with my first closest friend when I was a kid. And his name is Mitch Casey. And I remember, I think my earliest drive-in memories, there's 3 I can share with you, 4. I remember my dad taking the whole family, because that's how you used to go to the drive-in, right? The whole family piled in the car. And we ended up parking right next to the whole Casey family. Just by luck. I don't think it was planned. And the movie was Howard Hawks' Hatari, the John Wayne peacefully hunting animals in Africa because they're collecting them for, zoological parks and zoos and gaming preserves and so on. And that's a long movie. That's like a 3-hour movie.
So it was a double feature by itself, basically.
It was like an epic night at the drive-in. And the fact that the Caseys were with us, and Mitch was my best friend, and Mitch's older brother Reed was friends with my older brother Rick. It was one of those, spread blankets out in front of the car, and the adults sat in the cars and drank beer and talked, and we had our soda and popcorn, and we were in the front. And I have really fond memories of that night. And I still, when I hear the Henry Mancini Baby Elephant Walk, which is the top 40 hit that came out of that film unexpectedly, I get warm and fuzzies because of that night, seeing Hatari at the drive-in. My second drive-in memory, and we could date it by the release of the film because both these were brand new films. Although let's emphasize for your listeners, Mark, This is when movies did not open day and date everywhere.
Right.
This is when certain movies would open in rural settings, and that would mean sometimes we would get movies before they played Boston or New York. Sometimes they would open in the cities, and then it would take months, for these movies to gradually roll out across the United States. So the second film I remember seeing at the drive-in was The Incredible Mr. Limpet. My family was a Andy Griffith Show family, and Don Knotts was a big favorite, and we went to see every Don Knotts movie.
We've actually been talking about maybe doing a Don Knotts double feature.
Oh, you should do it.
We always title our weekends, and one of the titles is Nuts for Knots, and my title is Double Knots. So, but it would be Limpet and Ghost Mr. Chicken.
Oh yeah, those are the two. And my understanding is, and I've been researching this since, because I had done a long 2-part article for the magazine Monster! That my good friend Tim Paxton was co-editor on with Brian Harris and Tony Strauss and so on. And I did a 2-part article about made-for-TV horror and what predated what is now sort of the canon history of made-for-TV horror movies. Most of them start in 1969 with NBC showing Fear No Evil, but actually there was a lot that went on starting in the 50s. And The Ghost of Mr. Chicken apparently was originally slated to be a TV movie. And a lot of those Universal films that have that look to them, there's a look, Ghost of Mr. Chicken, Monsters Go Home, some of their action westerns, those were shot as made for TV. And then the executives would decide, let's put this out theatrically. Warner Brothers made Incredible Mr. Limpet. That was made for theatrical. And, my parents were set on seeing it as soon as that spread appeared in Life magazine that had color photos of Don Knotts live action talking to Don Knotts transformed into a fish. So that I remember that as being a really fun night out. And that was also, it was an unusual choice for the family because my dad did not like fantasy. My dad was not a fantasy, science fiction, horror kind of guy, but it was a war movie, right? My dad took me and my brother to all the war movies, and Mr. Limpet was like part war movie, part animated cartoon, part Don Knotts. So it was like the perfect merger of my mom loved Don Knotts, dad loved war movies, and to me, any reason to go to the drive-in was great. And the third memory, which is in many ways my favorite drive-in memory, is, and again, we could date it from the release of the films. And it's a weird double bill because it's a Disney film and a 20th Century Fox film. But, bookers and, what double bills played where, especially in New England, it all depended on what the bookers were throwing together, probably out of the Boston booking area. It was the Walt Disney Miracle of the White Stallions, which is a World War II movie about the rescue of the Lipizzaner stallions during World War II. So my dad wanted to see that. And because it was a Disney movie, I grew up in one of those families where we went to see every Disney movie. If it was in a theater and it was Disney, it didn't matter if it was Old Yeller and Savage Sam, or it was, The Misadventures of Merlin Jones. The family took us. And but the film that played before it, and I know it played before it because we were put in the back seat. The adults sat in the front, we were in the back seat. And my mom talked my sister, I have a younger sister, Kathy, into going to sleep because it was the day that Mars invaded Earth, which is this weird black and white 20th Century Fox release of a Robert L. Lippert production. And it's all set in one house. It's this amazing spread, this estate somewhere in California. And I remember watching it between the seats. Like, we weren't supposed to be watching it. But we had to, because I know my parents would have left if it had been the second feature. And they could not make head or tail of it because it's a whole movie where the Martians have created doppelgangers of each character. And at the end, the doppelgangers are poised to replace, the actual human beings. And my dad could not follow, how is he seeing himself? Wasn't she just over there? And it's one of those doppelganger movies where it all hinges on that kind of confusion. Right. And my dad was lost. He didn't have a clue what was going on. And I remember my mom saying things like, Well, this is kind of like the Twilight Zone, Dick, you know, which Dad didn't like either. And I have fond memories of that because I loved The Day That Mars Invaded Earth. And it has a very strange ending, especially for an early 60s, you know, movie that would be in a double bill with a Disney film. And, you know, those are my three first driving experiences that I remember, Mark, are those three. And that all would have been what, pre-63, pre-64. So I was born in 55. So, you know, I would have been 6 to 9 years old for those. And the other one I remember that we went to time and time again, and I hated it, and I still hate that film, is the Pat Boone vehicle, The Perils of Pauline. And it was another one of those awful Universal, you know, everything in shiny Technicolor, everything overlit. And I don't know why we ended up seeing it more than once. It can't be because the family loved it, but
I was going to say, was it so popular that it came back again and again, or was it just pushed farther and farther down the bill?
Is it popularity, or is it just that was a cheap rental, or Universal would just stick it on the bottom of a bill or middle of a bill? And typically New England drive-ins, the primary feature would be the second feature because, you know, they'd start the movies a little before sundown, so you weren't really seeing the beginning of the film as clearly. I know a lot of people have warm and fuzzies about drive-ins, particularly those listening to this show, but there's a lot of drawbacks to the old drive-in days. And one of them is the first feature was often difficult to see the first half hour of.
I remember when I saw, this is much, much later than we've been talking about, when I went to see Gladiator for the first time. Saw that at the Northfield Drive-In, which is a favorite of mine. I rediscovered drive-ins with the Northfield Drive-In because I had been living in Keene, and I suddenly found out, but there's a drive-in
right down there.
Away. And then I found out the Milford Drive-In was the same distance. I had two all of a sudden, so I went all the time. But they had started a little bit too early. In those opening scenes where people are on horseback in the woods, it was more of a radio drama than a film at that point. Ultimately,
exactly.
And the Northfield too, I'd never seen this anywhere else. Occasionally the lot would get foggy, and the projectionist came on over the speakers or over the radio at that point and said, if everybody turns on their engines, the fog will lift. And it did.
Yeah.
And maybe it was because of the way the size of the lot and the way it's ringed by trees or something like that. But every other time I went to a drive-in and there was fog, I was always like, why isn't the projectionist saying something? We can fix this.
Yeah, no, it's all, you know, you've learned from experience. It's really what the projectionist does or doesn't know. And also, how much does the projectionist even care? I've got vivid memories of seeing the Twin City Drive-In was one of my favorite drive-ins. It was on the Barrie and Montpelier Road, right between Barrie and Montpelier. It was approximately across the street and up a bit from the Wayside Diner, which is still there in the Barrie Montpelier Road. If any of your listeners want to have a great lunch, breakfast, or dinner, the Wayside Diner, and I am not being paid for this commercial. And the Twin City Drive-In, like the Northfield Drive-In, was in proximity to a river, and the fog would come rolling in. And I remember that there was this gruff old guy that was projectionist, and he would come on and say, "Put your engines on." And he wouldn't even explain why, right? But it would help lift the fog. I remember having to bang on the door of his projection booth because it was one of those dusk to dawn shows, and they were showing Sometimes a Great Notion. Paul Newman, Richard Jekyll, Michael Sarrazin, great 70s movie. He had the reels in the wrong order. And all of a sudden, Richard Jekyll is drowning, pinned under logs. And the character died and then reappeared.
He is risen. Jekyll is risen.
And he is risen. And I was like banging on the door, and the guy didn't want to open. And he finally opened. He was like, "What?" And I was like, "You've got the reels in the wrong order." And he was like, "No, I don't. Wait a minute." You know, and he slams the door. But it was too late. The experience had been blemished.
I've had that happen a couple times. I used to go to the Coolidge Corner Theater in Boston, again, back in the 90s, and they would do a lot of Hong Kong action marathons.
Oh, yeah.
And things. Yeah. And it was like a 6-hour marathon, and they ran Jackie Chan's Twin Dragons. And it was a print that had come from Hong Kong. And I believe the reels were numbered not in English numbers. So
right.
And it was a reel change. And oftentimes in a reel change, you're going from one scene or one location to another. So that makes sense. And he like rolled up his gloves to fight, and then it Reel change, cut to something else, fine. And then 20 minutes later, he enters the frame he was in 20 minutes earlier and beats the shit out of somebody. Like, wait a minute.
There you go. There
oh yeah,
you
I
go.
guess this isn't the way this movie. It totally made sense until that happened. That actually happened to us too. We ran a trauma film at the drive-in, and the reels somehow weren't numbered appropriately or something like that. And it was like Toxic Avenger 2 or something. And then suddenly it was like a Tarantino film. And somebody actually came and complimented us on that.
If they're going by the cans rather than the markings on the reel ends, you know, a lot of the times the reels got placed in the wrong cans.
Right.
And it also depends, you know, most of our drive-ins when I was a kid growing up obviously had the old-fashioned projector system. It wasn't the platter system that later became codified. So, you know, who knows what those reels go through from theater to theater. You know better than most of us, Mark. Now,
it's great to see these old cans that have old shipping labels from the various. You can see the life of a print on these cans sometimes. And also on the paper reel bands for the reels, we played Poor Pretty Eddie this last season.
Oh, I know that film well. Yes.
And I'd never seen it before. I'd had it on Blu-ray, but I just hadn't got around to watching it. And I was just like, this is a memorable experience. And it had gone, you know, with these films, they'd get retitled to try to be
Pink
more
Motel.
marketable.
Yeah, it was Pink Motel at some point, right?
This one had, I posted a picture on our Patreon of this. It had 3 titles on it that had been scratched off and the next one written. And I think the title we saw it under was Black Vengeance. That was the title on screen, cut in. Yeah. And that was the most prominent title on the reel band of the 3 or 4. But it was like something about a legend, something about a hotel. I don't even know if it said Poor Pretty Eddie anywhere on there, but that's something I've always admired about old time hucksterism in drive-in exploitation and exhibition is Sam Sherman and Independent International, Al Adamson were kings of this with the whole, we put it out as this one title that didn't quite work. Let's, Nurse Sherry.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
It's a nurse movie. It didn't quite work. How about it's an Exorcist movie? Great.
Yeah. Blood of Ghastly Horror. I mean, how many times did that add at least 4 titles and 4 different incarnations? I used to frequent the drive-ins with any title that sounded vaguely European because I was a Mario Bava fan from about the age of 8. And you never knew if it was going to be a Bava film or not. There wasn't a clue. There was nowhere to get information back then. There was no internet. There were no books, about any of this. The only magazine that ever mentioned Mario Bava was Castle of Frankenstein. And that's because Joe Dante Jr. was one of the reviewers. And Joe would always cite if it was a Bava film. But even then, I remember catching one Bava film, and it was one of the Mickey Lyon, directed by Mickey Lyon, one of his pseudonyms. So you never knew. And there were a number of companies like Europix they would actually not just reissue the same movie with a different title. They would chop them down. And the one that I would always seek out, because seeing it in color was always the treat, was Kill Baby Kill.
Oh yeah.
But it played our area, meaning down where you grew up, as well as up where I grew up in northern Vermont. You were in southern New Hampshire.
Right.
It played as Curse of the Living Dead. It was part of that, 3-picture. And they chopped it down. They chopped all 3 of those films down for that triple bill. But it was in color. I could see it in color instead of black and white on television. So
now, when you would see ads for movies that were playing local drive-ins, it was just the title, right? Did your newspaper have the ad mats with artwork or anything?
Glorious ad mats.
Oh, wonderful.
The Burlington Free Press used to have, my memory is a full page, sometimes 2, and those theaters were using the ad mats, and that was the Free Press in its old incarnation when it was big. Now it's a little thin ghost of its former self. And the Times Argus, less so. The Times Argus was the Barrie, Montpelier area newspaper. Sometimes ad mats, but even then it would just be like the title and maybe a small graphic. Whereas the Burlington paper, I remember before I had my license, just aching to go see those 2 Andy Milligan movies that had just opened. And there was nobody I could talk into driving me to those, and until I hit age 16 in 1971, shit out of luck, as they say. Before I hit 16, I had 1 or 2 friends who had their licenses or their permits, and I could occasionally talk them into driving. But I only had a couple of friends that dug horror movies. Most people, and movies were getting rougher at that time. They were getting really graphic And if it was breasts, if it was sex, fine. It was easy to talk and somebody at the drive-in into them. But for horror, I had one friend threaten to beat me up and throw me out of my own car if we didn't go home because he was so pissed after the first movie in the double bill.
What was the movie? Do you recall?
Oh, I'll never forget. It was the Jerry Gross Cinemation double bill. I drink your blood, I eat your skin. And the first film they showed, this was at the Barry Montpelier Road, was I Drink Your Blood, which I thought was great. And it was one of my best friends in high school, Alan Finn, who went on to a sterling career. He was a genius in terms of science and computers, but he was pissed. He was pissed. And when the feature ended, he was not kidding me. Bissette, I will beat you up and throw you out of this car and drive home. And I was laughing at that point. I was like, okay, I got my money's worth.
Right.
Let's go home. Years later on video, I caught up with I Eat Your Skin. And it's like, oh, well, I'm glad that's the one I missed.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's such a funny double feature because with the titles and the ad campaign, you're like, oh, these are going to be two gruesome, aggressively gory films. And it's like, well, one is an old black and white voodoo film that's partly a Bond spoof. And the other's
if that had been first, no problem. We'd have been there for both.
It's a fun movie. Yeah. You would have lulled him into a sense of safety.
He would, right. And then I Drink Your Blood would have had us reeling. But, it was a real, I still have memories outside of drive-in movies of seeing Night of the Living Dead for the first time at UVM, part of the Lane series. So it was in their prestige theater space at University of Vermont up in Burlington. And the film either had not played our area or, again, I didn't have a license, so I didn't get to go. So we saw it at the Lane series. Again, it was my friend Alan Finn, and it was my high school sweetie to me. I don't know what I was to her. And he got so pissed that he walked out. He walked out right as the ghouls are reaching into the truck and beginning to pull pieces out of the couple. I had to go out and talk him into staying. Like, Alan, I got to see the end of this. You can't go. All right, I'll be out here. He was ripshit. I go back in, and then Jill had to leave when the little girl stabbed her mother. So I'm bringing her out of the theater in tears. There's Alan, red-faced, waiting, and I'm begging them both to wait because I have to go in and see the end of this movie. It was a weird time for the genre because the movies were really beginning to grow teeth. You didn't know what you were in for. And I miss that about movies. I mean, anything playing in a theater these days is pre-sanitized, homogenized, but man, late 60s, all through the 70s, you never knew what you were in for. You had no idea. You'd go see something that had bucolic ads on television, and then it was Walking Tall, which is just a wall-to-wall bloodbath.
Right.
And as the 70s went on, it got weirder. A movie like Buster and Billy was sold like, it was going to rekindle memories of your high school prom. And it's this, excruciating rape revenge drama with Jan Michael Vincent. And it's a great little movie, but oh my God, you didn't know what you were in for.
I had a delayed experience with a lot of that because these are the movies that I saw on Saturday afternoon TV as a kid on the Boston stations. And the biggest memory was seeing, well, two actually. I remember late at night on WPAX, I saw What You Did, the William Castle movie.
Oh yeah.
It was the latest I'd ever stayed up in my life. It was like the late movie, or the Channel 11 Film Festival, they called it. And it started off pretty light in tone. And I'm a little kid and I'm like, oh, these kids are home alone. They're making prank calls. Wait, he killed a woman.
Murder.
Wait, now it's the idea of an adult who wanted to kill kids who were home alone. And I was up late and my parents were asleep in the other room. But in my brain, I'm like, I'm alone. He's going to come and get me. And then seeing Bless the Beasts and the Children on WLVI one afternoon, which again, it starts off very light in tone. And by the end, I was like sitting there crying in front of my grandparents' TV. So I came to like distrust anything that wasn't totally overtly a comedy as a little kid because the 70s downer endings, late 60s.
Even comedies. I mean, I remember a friend walking out of Harold and Maude. There's that amazing scene where Bud Cort is sitting there talking to one of his relatives that he despises, and he picks up a cleaver and lops his hand off. And it's a stunt. He's doing it to shock them, and they quickly reveal it's not real. But, I mean, and that was considered a feel-good comedy at that time. You know, it didn't do well because it's a very strange comedy, and then it got a second wind as kind of a midnight movie.
Right.
But yeah, you didn't know what you were in for back then. And I missed that about going, I mean, drive-ins particularly. I think the last genuine drive-in experience I had that felt like a drive-in experience was going to the Northfield Drive-In, and it was a double bill of Sin City and the remake of the Amityville Horror. That's a drive-in double bill.
Right.
Up here, we've got 2 drive-ins in driving distance, 2 others if I want to drive 2 hours. But it's all the same crap that just played at the local hardtops.
That's something I noticed in the late 90s, early 2000s. And I did a cross-country trip. I've done a couple. And part of the idea was, we're going to go cross-country. We'll see all kinds of cool movies in different theaters. And it was the same, like 6 movies playing everywhere.
Yeah.
And
same half dozen.
With drive-ins.
Yeah.
And that's why I started driving out to the Riverside Drive-In near Pittsburgh for their Monsterama shows, because it was cool retro stuff. It was recreating something I never got the first time. And then I discovered the Mahoning, and I started going there, and it was cool retro stuff. And the reason the Mahoning does what it does was because there's an indoor theater literally like 2 minutes up the street with 6 screens. Why try to play the same things? And then another drive-in 20 minutes away that would be playing the exact same things. It's the same double bills everywhere, regardless of what the genre is. So when you were a kid, you had mentioned the drive-in that you'd seen these at. Were there others nearby? Yep. Did you go to a few different?
Yeah, there were a lot of drive-ins when I was a kid. I grew up in Duxbury, Vermont, and then we moved to Waterbury, which was literally across the Winooski River from Duxbury. Let's see, an easy driving distance, meaning, you grow up in Vermont, half hour is no distance to drive to do anything. We drive a half hour to go swimming, to get ice cream, So we had the Twin City Drive-In on the Barre Montpelier Road was our closest drive-in. And up in the Burlington area, there were, I believe, 5 drive-ins. And one of them, the Sunset Drive-In, is still up there.
Oh, wow.
It's in Colchester. It's at the top of the hill.
Okay.
You can get right off Interstate 89, and the Sunset Drive-In is still there. There was the St. Albans Drive-In, which was, further north. There was also the Mallett's Bay Drive-In, which was part of sort of that Burlington complex. And there was a drive-in in South Burlington called the Shelburne Drive-In, but it wasn't in Shelburne. It was just heading south on, Route 7, south out of Burlington, down heading toward Charlotte and Shelburne. So we had a lot of drive-ins. And before I could drive to them, I used to clip out the Burlington Free Press ads because, they would show all those weird, the ghastly ones, the rats are coming, the werewolves are here. All that shit was playing up there. I remember the Ray Dennis Steckler films. I didn't get to see them at the drive-in because I didn't have a license yet. I couldn't convince somebody to drive me, but I kept those ads. When they were re-released as Teenage Psycho meets Bloody Mary, it was actually the Incredibly Strange Creatures Who Stopped Living and Became Mixed Up Zombies. But all that stuff was playing up in our area. And as I discovered later on, it turns out we were also part of the test markets for Hallmark out of Boston. Hallmark was the outfit, not Hallmark, that has the channel now of family movies.
Right, far from it.
Far from it. Hallmark was the one that released, the 2 biggies were Mark of the Devil with the vomit bag, rated V for violence. That was the one that, that actually played hardtop theaters. I first saw it at a drive-in, but that actually played hardtop theaters in our area. And I still have vomit bags. If you need one, Mark, just let me know.
I have one for that film somebody gave me.
Okay, good. And I've got bundles of them that I pick up at flea markets. And Last House on the Left. And the reason I bring up that it was a test market is when I first saw those films on the Barre Montpelier Road, they were complete. The ads said R, but they were the complete prints. And subsequently, when I went to the Joe Kubert School in Dover, New Jersey, I would revisit those films when they would pop up either at a New Jersey drive-in or on 42nd Street. And they always were cut when I saw them the second, third, fourth time. Every time I saw them, more was missing from my original viewing of them at the Twin City Drive-In up on the Barre Montpelier Road. And only later did I find out, in reading about Hallmark, and also I got to interview one of the partners who had been part of Hallmark a friend of mine, Stephen Twiss, gave me the guy's information, and he confirmed for me that Vermont was part of their circuit because they knew there were no MPAA, watchdogs up here. Like, who in Northern Vermont was going to care, whether it was the R print or not. So we tended to get the hard prints from the Hallmark pictures. That was not the typical practice with the other distributors. The Milligan films that played around the country, it was the same edit that played around, unless the projectionists, they chopped it up. I Drink Your Blood, when I saw that, we saw the one that, the partial infamy of my I Drink Your Blood is that they fudged the rating. The MPAA saw it, said, you've got to cut it. And every print was different because the instructions were phoned to the theaters as to what had to come out. And, projectionists.
Right.
But I remember seeing it first run when it opened. It was already cut. It was already, the really gruesome bits were gone. So I never saw the entire film until that wonderful DVD came out of the complete version. Even though Chaz Ballin, who was a good friend of mine, Chaz was always looking for what bootleg has the most complete version.
I remember those days.
So we had a lot of drive-ins, and the northernmost for us would have been the St. Albans Drive-In. But in the Burlington area alone, Mark, 5 drive-ins, probably, plus a multitude of hardtop theaters, which gradually over time, a couple of the key ones burned down in Burlington. The Strong Theater, which was the Prestige Theater in downtown Burlington, it was right up the street from the Flynn, next block up toward UVM, and that burned down. And the State Theater, which was up off of Church Street, and it was a little side street, State Street, and the State Theater played a lot of exploitation. And right next to it was the Black Cat Bar. And they, once I was older, drinking age in Vermont at that time was 21, not 18. And once I was 21, we'd go there because you could get a yard of beer at the Black Cat, and that made every movie at the State a little better. So.
Now, the drive-ins that you recall showing the Hallmark films and the exploitation, the fun stuff, did those play at specific theaters, or did every theater sort of mix it up? Because the research that I'm doing for the Pennsylvania area near where we are, it was really 1 or 2 theaters that played all the, let's say, fun stuff, whereas the others were pretty much mostly mainstream family.
Well, okay, here's how it went. The Mounds Bay Drive-In was the first drive-in I remember sliding into adult film projection. Okay, like I would go up there to catch X-rated films, and it was in part because it was one of the few drive-ins where what was on the screen was not visible from the road. Okay, I mean, one of my favorite drive-in memories is when I was probably, I had to have been 10, because it had to have been 1965. Is driving with my family to or from visiting relatives, and the Sunset Drive-In, you could see the screen from the highway, and there's Ghidra flying. And not only was it cool to see Ghidra flying over Vermont, but I so wanted to see that movie, and nobody in my family was ever going to take me to see a Godzilla movie. So the Mounts Bay Drive-In got into the hard stuff early. And by hard stuff, I mean not just X and XXX adult sex films, but they're also the drive-in that would do, like, out of the blue, there'd be a triple bill of Groove Tube, Reefer Madness, and Night of the Living Dead. So who knows where they were pulling the prints from, right, by then. And a lot of those were probably flat rate $25 rentals for them. So, they're paying a book or what, $75, $100 for the bill, and they pocket whatever they take in. And that drive-in was packed that night. That was like 2 head movies and a zombie movie. You can't go wrong with that. The other drive-ins, it was mix and match. The Twin City Drive-In, let's not forget that at that time, especially in the 70s, you talk about the difference between exploitation and mainstream movies. The 70s is when 20th Century Fox would put out double bills of Twins of Evil and Vampire Circus or Hands of the Ripper.
That MGM making blaxploitation movies and things like that.
Yeah, so by 71, a lot of those walls had come down. So you could easily catch the Omega Man playing with Skyjacked. And to me, that's 2 exploitation films, but those are mainstream movies. It was a Charlton Heston double bill that night. On the other hand, the same theater would also be playing that Living Dead triple bill of Curse of the Living Dead, Fangs of the Living Dead, Revenge of the Living Dead, same screen that a week before may have shown a fairly current MGM film double billed with Barbarella. They would usually pick up an earlier film as a second feature or co-feature. The Burlington drive-ins, again, a mix and match. I remember the same drive-in on the Shelburne Road is where I saw A Fistful of Dollars and For a Few Dollars More. And a couple of years later, 2 Fulci movies. So
was that theater set down?
Yeah. You sort of had to drive down a bit.
Okay.
And it was on the lake side of Route 7. So it was kind of a down drive, and then the screen faced the road, but you couldn't really see it from the road, just because there were trees and so on. But
I remember I had relatives that live in Burlington, and we would visit a few times a year. And I remember going with my father and my uncle to pick up my cousin who worked at some fast food restaurant, and they had sort of like a stockade fence on the edge of the parking lot. But through it, you could see the screen. And I remember my uncle saying, "Don't look," because apparently they were showing an adult film or something that night. And all I remember is him saying, "Don't look," and he says, "Oh, it looks like there's something violent going on."
Oh yeah. I mean,
so that's the only knowledge I have of that theater, is that it was sort of set down from some fast food place.
I remember seeing with my friend Jack Vanuker, we drove from Johnson, Vermont down to that Shelburne screen, and it was City of the Living Dead under its US title, which was
Nightmare City.
Night of the Zombies, I think.
Oh, okay.
Nightmare City was the Umberto Lenzi City of the Walking Dead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But anyway, it doesn't matter. And it was double billed. There were 2 horror films, and everybody was so pissed at the end of the Fulci movie. That's the one that ends with the kid running toward the camera, and then the film kind of stutters. It doesn't really have an ending. It's just sort of like the money ran out, or Lucia went, "Fuck it, it's the alternate reality," and horns honking, not as applause, but people pissed. And Jack and I going, "Let's get out of here." And I don't even know what the second film was. And for me to leave a double bill, that never happened.
As a kid, I remember going with friends to see my best friend and his parents. We went to see the Summer Rental and Witness. And they had already seen, I mean, not brilliant films in the scheme of things, but we wanted to see a John Candy comedy. And I remember my friend's parents had already seen Witness. So they started up the car and left, and I'm just like, but it's 2 movies. You're supposed to watch 2. Yeah. And even now at our theater, people will leave after the first movie, and I'm like,
oh,
really?
You just want to stop them? Yeah, right.
What are you doing? There's one. In some cases, there's 2 or 3 more movies on our bills, and it's just like, well, I guess they got what they paid.
When Grindhouse opened at the indoor theater in Hanover, I knew the manager there at the time. It was the Nugget Theater.
Oh yeah, I've been there.
I loved it. I mean, I went back twice. I saw it myself the first time. Then I took our son Mike to see it. People left after the first movie, and I went out to get popcorn. I asked the manager, why are people going? And he's like, this happens every show. People don't understand double bills anymore. And Grindhouse was what, 10 years ago, Mark?
Yeah.
And already, and I could see it at the Center for Cartoon Studies. I used to do movie nights every Wednesday. And if I did a double bill, half the students were gone after the first movie. And it was like, and I know it's not attention span. They would say, "Oh, it's too long to sit." And I'm like, you just said you binged this cable show. I know that you just sat for 13 hours and played a video game. That's
the contemporary discussion. It's like, I don't know if I have it in me to watch a 2-hour movie. So we're going to watch 5 episodes of this hour-long TV show
instead. Right. And yeah, but anything went, to answer your question. I don't remember much rhyme or reason.
Okay.
There was a period of time when in the 60s, the demarcation was clearer. Like the stranger stuff would play at the St. Albans Drive-In or at the Mounts Bay Drive-In. But as of 1971 was sort of the watershed year of everything went crazy. I mean, let's not forget, that's the year in which Columbia released Roman Polanski's Macbeth. Warner Brothers had Dirty Harry and Ken Russell's The Devils out there. Clockwork Orange, that was Warner Brothers as well. Those were all 1971. And that meant that mainstream, big budget studio films now were stronger, harder R's than the stuff that had been coming out from Russ Meyer or Europix or Andy Milligan, And after that, my memory is anything goes. At almost any screen. There may have been one holdout family drive-in in the Burlington area. I can't recall which one it would have been, but it's the one that closed first.
And it's like totally the opposite now. What keeps most drive-ins in business in most theaters are those family, very, very mainstream,
Exactly.
broad appeal films. And,
Yeah.
you know, as an adult who we both love this kind of stuff, even in like back in the 90s, it's like, oh, no, the new horror movie is coming out. Is it going to play at the drive-in? No. It's the Disney film. It's the mainstream action. It was always Kipling Cinemas in Brattleboro is where I had to go to see all the new horror movies. They always made sure they played everything there. And that was like this little
the
statement.
Kipling and the Keen, the six cinemas in
Keen Cinemas as well. I saw a lot of good stuff there over the years, and everywhere
now,
else. Just
you mentioned the Milford Drive-In.
Yes.
So Northfield Drive-In, I did not frequent when I lived in Brattleboro because they tended to show the family fare, right? But the Milford Drive-In, that's where I first saw The Brood.
Oh, wow.
Playing with Mother's Day.
Nice. Were they a single screen at that time, or were they two?
Oh, it was a single screen. There were no two screens. The only two screen drive-in anywhere in driving distance where I grew up was the Twin City Drive-In. There were two screens that were angled so that you couldn't see them, but you could hear the sound bleed through from the other film on the speaker, right? So, but there were no two screen theaters in southern Vermont. I mean, I remember driving up to Ascutney with my friend Peter Beach, my only trip to the drive-in that was in Ascutney, Vermont, and it was Humanoids from the Deep and Galaxy of Terror. Perfect Roger Corman double bill, you know.
We actually have an old New World Pictures plastic reel in our collection in the projection booth. I was going through, we have a bunch of what I called our grindhouse prints. They're old 70s, early 80s prints that Jeff, the owner, bought that we run for various occasions. And I was looking through to make sure to match the reels up, and I looked and it was this orange reel with like the old New World, or I think I maybe identified what year it was, but it was a very specific New World Pictures logo that I wasn't familiar with. And I said to everybody who was nearby, never throw this away. Even if it breaks,
right.
I want
this. Is holy. This is holy.
The Scutney was the second closest drive-in to me. I was in Claremont, New Hampshire, right over the river, and I remember going to a Scutney not that far after you did. I think it was the Great Train Robbery, the Michael Crichton Great Train Robbery, and Moonraker. So it was a double feature, and I remember clearly seeing that there. And my parents were not the type to want to drive very far to see a movie, so it was really for me always just in town. And I have the vaguest memory of that theater. So you went in 78, 79?
Let's see. Humanoids from the Deep, wasn't that 80?
Was it? Maybe it was.
81. I mean, I didn't move back. I didn't move back to Vermont until summer of 79. So it probably was 1980. It was before my first wife, Marlene, who was named Nancy at that time, moved from New Mexico to Vermont so that we could live together. So it was before that. So it would have been 1980, summer of 1980. Peter Beach and I we would drive a long way to see something in a drive-in. I remember driving with Peter, again, this would have been 1980. We drove all the way up to Montpelier to the Twin City Drive-In. It was still open because I had never seen They Came From Within, the David Cronenberg film, Shivers. And I found out somehow that it was playing up there. And Pete said, oh, I'll go. That's a haul from Grafton, Vermont, up to the Barry Montpelier Road. But we went up and had, an early dinner at the Wayside Diner and then went over to the drive-in. And it was a classic night at the drive-in. For those of you listeners who do not know the film Shivers, aka They Came From Within, it is David Cronenberg's first feature, which involves sexual parasites that look like these slithering pieces of feces that they want to get inside of you. And once they're inside of you, they use your body as a means of reproduction, and they spread by making you horny so that you will crave sexual contact with any other being in your reach. And it's a very transgressive film, especially for 1976 when it came out, 75. So I hadn't seen it yet. I'd read about it and I had seen Cronenberg's other films, and I was a diehard Cronenberg junkie, but I'd never seen it. We drove up and we get our parking space early, because we had misjudged how long it would take to get up there. Even with dinner, we were there early. So we got a good spot. And this carload of teenagers pulled over, I think to the right of us, I'm pretty sure. And, it was like two couples, I think. And Pete starts laughing and I'm like, what? And he just takes his thumb and jerks his thumb. So I'll look over. They are papering over the windows of their car so that nobody can see into their car, right? So they're there to make out more than likely, or to smoke combustibles that they don't want visible to anybody else. Either way, So the movie starts and everything's quiet. I mean, it's a pretty somber film at the beginning, and it goes off the deep end really fast. And at one point in the film, Barbara Steele kisses this woman, and there's a close-up of the bulge in her throat as the parasite comes up her throat, and then there's a bulge in the other woman's throat as the parasite slides down her throat. And at that second, the door of the back of the car next to us flew open. And the girl in the car says, "If you ever fucking try that again, I'll kill you." And Pete and I could not stop laughing. It's not because we were applauding whatever was going on in the car. It was just the timing was like, oh my God. Anyway, that made for a very memorable night at the drive-in.
That's one of those things, is that the drive-in is a unique way to watch movies. I mean, film fans have, our bouquet of memorable in-theater experiences where things go on. But at the drive-in, it's this other animal. Like I've talked about how some people I've seen bring a couch to the drive-in, to the Monsterama show, and they set up a couch and they watch movies. I was at Milford once, and somebody brought like a love seat and an oriental rug and 2 speaker stands with speakers on it, where they essentially recreated their living room at the drive-in. And I've seen wedding proposals over the speakers at the drive-in. I mean, all kinds of things. So
yeah, you never know.
It's its own little community.
It is. And you never know if somebody's going to do, there's the downside of that, people turning their headlights on in the middle of the movie and everybody honking their horns, like, turn those damn lights off. There's one early memory I didn't share with you, which I have rarely shared. I think I wrote about it in one of the zines I write for. When I was really young, probably 10 years old, 9 or 10 years old, we went to visit relatives in Pennsylvania. And I had a couple of cousins there. Now, it was Pennsylvania accents they had, but it sounded like Southern accents to me. I'm a Yankee kid, Northern Vermont. I'm told my accent doesn't come through except when I'm hanging out with my friend Joe Citro. So, but they sounded Southern to me, and I liked my cousins, but I didn't know them particularly well. And the older of the two could drive. So it was decided that me, the cousin who was closer to my age, and the older cousin, we were going to go to the drive-in that night. And they told our parents we were going to see, I don't remember what it was, Old Yeller and Savage Sam or whatever. We actually went to see 2000 Maniacs.
Excellent.
And it was so traumatizing that we left after the movie. Like, we knew we're not supposed to see anything like this. And the older of my 2 cousins said, none of us can tell anybody what we just saw. And for me, it sounded like the Southern accents in 2000 Maniacs was awfully close to the accents of my relatives in Pennsylvania. So for like half the movie, until I could see they were freaking out too. I mean, that was the first gory movie I ever saw. The only other film I remember even coming close to that would have been, Major Dundee, the Charlton Heston, Sam Peckinpah film, pretty tame by contemporary standards, but that had bloodshed for a mid-60s studio film. But 2000 Maniacs was like, oh my God, cutting off her thumb, then cutting off her arm, and we were kind of shell-shocked, and we lied to our parents and said, well, we'd seen Savage Sam or whatever we were supposed to, whatever we told them we were going to see. So we came home early. We were like shell-shocked, and we swore, we're not going to tell anybody what we actually went to see. And that was the first hardcore exploitation film I ever saw. And I've already compartmentalized that out of my memory just because of that vow we took, and I remember craving seeing stuff like that again, but also being really afraid of seeing stuff like that. But by the time you're a teenager, you're just like, hey, bring it on, and by 1970, 71, they were bringing it on.
And was that around the time you had said that you had a license and you were able to go more frequently on your own?
Yeah. I got my license mark in March of 71. So my birthday is mid-March, and I had to get tested twice because I didn't pass the first time. We had one of those towns where they have a stop sign where no stop sign should be. Mm-hmm. I didn't stop. So I knew second time they were going to take me back there, and I stopped. But yeah, so I got my license spring of 71. Perfect time to have a license because that means everything at the drive-ins. Also, at that time, my family had a grocery store. So I had a lot of disposable cash because I worked 40 hours a week or more at our store, and I saved it. I saved enough money that I paid for 3 years of college.
Excellent.
After graduating high school. I had that in my savings. Also, it was an escape. You know, I knew when my dad scheduled himself, I was going to have to work those hours. So getting in the car and going to the drive-in, you know, meant dad could not call me in from the house to work his shift for any reason. I was gone. So I would go to the drive-in, no exaggeration, 2 to 3 times a week.
Wow.
I tried to see everything I could. And, you know, in the summer, particularly July 4th weekend, Memorial Day, when there were dusk to dawn shows, you know, I could catch 12 movies in a week if I staggered which drive-in I was going to correctly. And since my mom and dad did the scheduling for the store, I would just, by that time, I was like, okay, I'm going to be gone Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And I'd go to 3 different drive-ins and just binge. And that was my crash course. That was my education. You know, that was learning storytelling. It was a craving for movies and it was a craving for cinema, but it was also my crash course as a storyteller. It was preparing me in a lot of ways for what I would do with my life working in comics. You learn how to tell stories. You learn how to tell stories from badly made movies, and you learn how to tell stories from movies that are incredibly well made. And sometimes you learn more from the badly made movies, you know, the ones, when I say badly made,
I always say that you don't really know what a good movie is until you see enough bad movies, you know?
Well, I even use the word bad loosely. Like I just caught on Blu-ray the Columbia film from 1977, The Farmer, with Gary Conway. And it just came out from Scorpion releasing, and it looks like it's going to be one of those titles where they put out 300 copies and it's gone and people go nuts. It's very crudely made in one way, but it's one of those, you know, rural action revenge movies that the crudities lend it a lot of weight, a lot of gravitas. And there's one aspect of the crudity that turns out to be integral to making the ending work. So a lot of those films that the critics were dismissing were some of my favorite movies. You know, nobody could give the time of day to Twitch of the Death Nerve when it was new, better known these days as Bay of Blood. But that's one of those movies I dropped everything to go see anytime it played. And it had 3 or 4 different titles, Twitch of the Death Nerve, Last House Part 2. But I would always go to catch it because it's one of my favorite Baba films. And I just love that stacked deck approach to storytelling of, okay, we're going to kill every character. And there were also films that, you know, people don't talk about these days that I would see at the drive-in, and they had, you know, White Line Fever is a perfect drive-in movie.
We ran that a few years ago at our drive-in, and the print that Sony sent us had Spanish subtitles on it. It was in English, but with Spanish subtitles. So I tell everybody I learned trucker Spanish that night.
There you go. There you go. That's a great, you know, Jonathan Kaplan was a great director, great filmmaker, great storyteller. And that movie plays beautifully on a drive-in. The Sergio Leone, you know, the Clint Eastwood spaghetti westerns, those are great drive-in movies. You know, those are made to be seen outdoors on a big screen.
We ran those last year, and we have this CinemaScope screen, like one of the biggest on the East Coast. It's huge. So to see those Leone compositions fill the screen on a nice, clear, like very warm, not uncomfortable night, it was beautiful.
That's a religious experience to me, and I'm not exaggerating in any way. I mean, that to me is like divinity on earth. And you know, and so there are certain films, the Leone westerns, any Baba film, Billy Jack, you know, I mean, there are some movies that are just great drive-in movies where everything about them as movies that makes them pleasurable, vital, is amplified if you see it under pristine conditions at a drive-in. You know, and that was rare. Pristine condition at a drive-in is a, you know, those 3 words don't
depending
really
on
together.
how far into a film's run you saw it. It's the, you know, as you said, how much of it was left to be
seen.
Well,
right. And not just the print, like, is it going to sprinkle or rain that night?
Well,
is the fog going to roll in? How bad are the mosquitoes going to be? You know, is some asshole going to keep putting their lights on? Is it going to be a movie you love, but people are leaving, and every time they leave, they put their headlights on, and you're, you know, so you never know. I mean, one of the variables of drive-ins is you have no control over the conditions, and neither does the theater manager. Right? It's not like a hardtop theater where the managers and staff, when they're conscientious, can really pretty well ensure you're going to have a good viewing experience. Even if people are being assholes in the audience, they can get them out of there. Drive-in, you're at the whim of the fates, and that's part of the fun of it too. That roll of the dice.
And one of the things I've always enjoyed about the drive-ins, and we can talk about this too. My memory when I was a kid, when I used to go, is that just about everybody sat inside their car. It was, any number of cars, front windshield pointed at the screen, and that was that. At some point, it seemed to me in the 90s, and maybe this was with SUVs coming into play, it was more, especially if you see an aerial photo of a contemporary drive-in, most cars are faced away from the screen, the hatch is open, and people are sitting outside. And in your youth, do you remember much? Because you mentioned sitting outside.
No, it really switched in the 80s. Okay. I remember in Vermont Drive-Ins, part of it was people were always conscientious that somebody was behind them. And at a certain point in the 80s, people didn't give a fuck anymore, right? People thought nothing of pulling in front of you with a van, and now you're the one that has to move because you cannot see the screen any longer. And it was worse when they would pull in with a van that had two chairs bolted to the top of it, so you knew they were going to be sitting on the van. Yeah, in the 60s, and I'd say until probably 75, 1975, there was a certain courtesy that was paid, at drive-ins where people behaved, but that's also pre-radio, being able to get the sound on your radio. It's prior to that. So you were restricted by, you had to hook those speakers to your windows, right? And you could only hook one because the distance between speakers, there was no way, unless you had a Hummer, that you could actually put two speakers and two windows. So there was a bit more mutual respect that other people were going to be there, and people were conscientious who had pickups to park toward the back. They didn't want to be blocking people. I don't remember it getting rude until mid 70s into the 80s, and even then, by and large, that was rare. I don't remember ever having confrontations, ugly confrontations at a drive-in, but you can move your car. Yeah. If somebody pulled in front or next to you and you didn't want to be in their proximity, you moved your car. And avoid confrontation.
With me at the drive-in, I'm an indoor sitter. I kind of grew up that way. Friends like to sit outside, and it is lovely to sit outside under the stars.
It can be.
Feel the atmosphere. But I like to be in my own little pod. I could have my food here, and I can adjust the radio. And the big thing for me at the drive-in has way better than indoor theaters in terms of viewing experience is that if anybody around you is a little bit annoying, you just roll up your windows and turn up the radio a little bit. And unless they're really loud and obnoxious, the headlight thing you can't fix, but distractions outside, you just, your own little world there. I did learn that while as a child sitting in the back seat is fantastic and works great, the back seat is only good for one thing as an adult at the drive-in. We went with friends to the Northfield Drive-In post-college, and there were four of us in one car, and you cannot get low enough in a seat as an adult to see anything through a windshield unless you're a contortionist or.
It's not possible. Yeah.
No.
It's also, let's not forget, the size of cars changed in the 70s.
True.
Right. So American cars in the 60s, all accommodating anywhere you sat, you could see through the windshield. As they got smaller, once compact cars were in, front seat, you're fine, back seat, you're screwed. But there were also fun aspects of, I remember seeing, again, with my friend Alan Finn, not a fan of horror movies, but man, Play Misty for Me worked for him. We were sitting on the front of the car with our backs on the windshields and rolled up coats as pillows. And when she comes out of the darkness and begins her attack on Clint Eastwood, he fell off the car in shock, which instantly makes it a better movie if your friend falls off the car in shock at any point in time.
Do you remember any ballyhoo gimmicks at the drive-ins when you used to go, like the vomit bags or anything like that? Or did any theaters participate in that?
I've still got the vomit bag. I missed, as I said earlier, I didn't have a license when the Teenage Psycho Meets Bloody Mary played. I would have loved to have seen that because the ad, that was one of those Ray Dennis Steckler where they had cash flag masks and they came running out to the cars. I would have loved to have.
That was exactly the one I was thinking of when I asked that question.
Yeah. I wish I'd gotten to go because the ad said monsters will run into the audience. Let's see. The gimmick I experienced, but it wasn't a drive-in, was I did get to see Polyester in Odorama.
Excellent.
And that may have been the last real gimmick movie that played mainstream venues. And that was, I remember I went to see it twice because I loved John Waters. I loved Polyester. It was a really fun movie. And I saw it with Marlene, my first wife, when it played at the Images Cinema in Williamstown, Massachusetts, which was the art house cinema, right? For that end of southern Vermont and northern Mass. And I wanted to see it again. But, you know, it only played 2 nights. We went the second night. Then it was popping up in Montpelier, and I had friends up in Montpelier, my old high school art teacher, Bill Cathy. And I rang up Bill and Sandra Cathy because we had stayed friends over the years. And I said, are you guys interested? And they were like, yeah, we'll go see that. So I met them at the Savoy Theater, downtown Montpelier, Odorama, got to experience it again. And when we came out, I just remember Bill shaking his head and going, so that director thinks that's a mainstream film?
Compared to his earlier films, yeah.
Made it even better. Yeah, made it even better. So, but yeah, the drive-in, you know, the era of drive-in gimmicks, it pretty much ended by early 70s. I mean, I remember being able to buy one-sheets or lobby cards from the Twin City Drive-In. The manager would sell us posters at $5 each, but they weren't really displaying them anymore. I mean, I don't even know why they had the ad materials anymore at that point, because most drive-ins just had, you know, their lettering out in front of the drive-in. I'm not sure how you have the setup at the Mahoning Drive-In.
We have a couple of poster cases in the snack bar, and I've been to a few drive-ins that do that, so I can see why some would still get them.
Right. And the Twin City Drive-In had one poster case there were 2 snack bars. No, there was one snack bar that you would enter from 2 sides, and they had a couple poster cases. So, okay, that's why they had them. But I like that one because the manager, I still have my Equinox poster, you know, from the Jack Harris release of the film Equinox. But gimmicks, no, you know, showmanship really was on the decline by 72, 73. And I would say by the mid 70s, we entered that really bleak era of, you know, newspapers would just put the title of what was playing. It was like, good luck figuring out what this is, right? And by the 80s, forget it. I don't even know how we found out Humanoids from the Deep was up in Ascutney. It may have even been just dumb luck. You know, we got in the car, we drove north, we saw the marquee, and I went, oh, Humanoids from the Deep, I'm there, you know? But the gimmicks, the era of gimmicks and real showmanship was over. You know, the most showmanship we got were how color faded with the snack bar.
Some of those old, that was beautifully preserved in some of the Something Weird Hey Folks It's Internet Times tapes, where it would be the food that was probably appetizing looking when they shot the short, but with the time and color fade, just these things that looked like mud burgers or some of them had damage that looked like radioactive green. Didn't Joe Dante use some of that in Hollywood Boulevard? Some of those old clips, and it's just like the least appetizing looking food. We're actually going to interview the president of Filmac in a week or so, who did the classic Let's All Go to the Lobby and a lot of the Dancing Hot Dog, all that stuff. So I'm going to probe his brain about the history of how
I can't wait to see that stuff. You know, also as it got later, I mean, I remember those between feature countdowns being spot on. You could, and then later, once they were beat up, they would, you know, the countdown would go from 8 to 4, and you hadn't even gotten out of your car yet because that much of the reel had gotten chewed up at some point. You know,
and it was up to the theaters a lot of the time to fill out the clips between the 3 minutes to go numbers. And we got one recently, or we were borrowed one recently, and Jeff and I were watching it as it was playing from the projection booth. And it was a lot of stuff we'd never seen before, which was cool. But it went from 1 minute to another, and I looked at it, I'm like, there's no way that was just 60 seconds. It's like,
no, they didn't clock them. It was just go and get your shit and get back to your car. I'm trying to think. I think the last time I went to a theater where there was a gimmick was probably, a drive-in theater was probably a showing of a 3D movie where we got the glasses, the red and green glasses.
This is huge for me. You actually saw 3D at a drive-in?
I think I did.
Because I've never heard about it being done. I know in the 80s, a story that I don't think I've told in the podcast is I went to see Space Hunter. That was that 80s 3D.
Oh yeah, that was supposed to be 3D, right?
When Hollywood was nervous about home video. Hollywood gets nervous about something and suddenly 3D comes back again every so many decades. I had seen Space Hunter at the Claremont Triple Cinemas, which was next door to the Claremont Drive-In where I used to go as a kid. And I was excited at the idea of a 3D movie on a giant screen. And it was Space Hunter and You're the Hunter from the Future, which is
perfect double bill. That's a perfect double bill.
Now a great double feature. You look back. And we drove in and we thought they would hand us 3D glasses at the ticket booth and they didn't. And other people were standing outside going, do you know where we get the glasses? And it turned out they showed it flat. And I since learned, I thought
it's not bright enough. There's not a bright enough throw. I think the one I saw was in California.
Okay. And I guess if you had Anaglyph 3D, it probably would work better theoretically. Do you remember what it was?
House of Wax.
House of Wax. Okay.
Yeah, it was the reissue of House of Wax, and it didn't work particularly well. I remember that, and it was visiting somebody in California. So I that's the last time I remember any kind of gimmick at a drive-in, and it was a popcorn fart, to use to use a trade term.
And did you continue patronizing, and I don't mean talking down, I mean visiting drive-ins throughout the course of your life, or as work and family took you in different directions, did you find yourself going less?
No, we went a lot, as often as we could. In fact, once the kids were of age, it was fun to go to the drive-ins because the Northfield Drive-In was a great place to go with kids. And we would bring, tons of blankets, set the kids up in front of the car, and that gave you private time as an adult, And if it was a triple bill, it was okay if the kids fell asleep. And often they would. You'd carry them sleeping into the car and head home after the second movie or the third. And I just loved the experience. It was important to me that my kids, that Danny and Maya, got to go to the drive-in at least a few times when they were little. But it had gotten harder, in part because usually if it was a film they wanted to see, we'd already seen it at the local hardtop, which would be the Kipling or the Latches or Bennington if we got ambitious. Or I would be going to drive-in to see something that wasn't into hardtops, like I think it's the Hawthorne Drive-In, just over the New York State border out of North Bennington. That's where I saw Evil Dead with my friend Jack Vanuker. That's where I saw Day of the Dead. That was the only theater anywhere in driving distance that showed Day of the Dead, the Romero film, when it was new, because the one that was in theaters everywhere was Return of the Living Dead, the Dan O'Bannon film, and Day of the Dead being unrated. So I wasn't going to take my kids to that, that indulgent as a parent as I might be, I was not out to inflict psychological damage on my kids. So by that time in my life, so what we're talking what now? So 82 to 87, the drive-in became the place that I might be able to catch some of the unrated films that weren't going to play any of the hardtop theaters. I either would catch them when I went to New York to drop off Swamp Thing pages. I would always still see movies in New York. I would plan my trip around catching one or two movies, or the drive-ins. And it got harder. This is still pre-internet era. So, you'd have to call the drive-in, listen to the recording to find out what was playing there. And I'm pretty sure it is called the Hawthorne Drive-In, the one that's right over the New York State border from North Bennington. That was my last drive-in experience. When our son Danny moved back east from California at the beginning of the pandemic, he and I wanted to go out and see something at a drive-in. It was April or May. It was early in the drive-in season. And The Wretched was, all we knew was the title. We didn't know anything about the film. And it was playing at that drive-in, the Hawthorne. And that's a haul from where we live in Middle Vermont.
I was going to say,
that's like 4 hours round trip. But we decided, hey, father-son outing, let's have fun. And we packed up food in the car because it was the pandemic. We called the theater, and their recording made it clear they were taking precautions. Cars had to park 2 to 3 car lengths away from each other, limited attendance. So we got there early. It was a perfect drive-in movie. I mean, The Wretched is, to my mind, is a great independent horror film. And it was a great drive-in experience because it was on the screen that's made out of wood. So it wasn't pristine visibility,
Okay.
right? It's not a proper reflective white screen, which, you know, Danny found unappealing and I found wonderfully appealing. It was like watching it on the Naughty Pine wall. And they started it a little early. In the beginning of the film, a lot of it takes place in the dark. So it was also a great driving experience because there were parts of the film I couldn't really make out what was going on until I bought it on Blu-ray later in the year and then watched it at home and went, oh, that's what was on the railing of the porch. But we had a great time. And it was also, you know, there's aspects of going to the drive-in. Our drive there was uneventful. But when we came back, we took a long way home. And we took all these odd routes because, you know, my son was born in southern Vermont. We drove a lot of roads that neither of us had been on for ages. And all this weird shit kept happening. And some of my favorite drive-in memories have nothing to do with the drive-in or what I saw there. It has to do with what happened on the way home. And this particular night, we got curious about, there's this side road between Searsburg, Vermont and Wilmington, Vermont, that cuts down to Clarksburg area in northern Mass. And we got curious because the last time I driven through there's one of these right-wing homes that had a back end of a tractor trailer parked in their yard. And it had like the names stenciled on the side of the truck of these now infamous places like Ruby Ridge. And at the bottom, it had the name of that village that we were in. Like, what could have possibly happened here to compare to Ruby Ridge and Oklahoma City bombing and so on? Well, somebody who lived there thought, you know. Well, we drove there, and whoever lives there now had built this weird complex of like chicken coop-like structures. And it was this weird honeycomb of improvised, I don't know if it was living spaces or storage spaces, but, you know, we slowed down, but we didn't slow down too much because it's like, we didn't want to bring any attention to our car, but it was like, what is going on here? And as we pull by across the street from this complex, it kind of spills over the road. There's a dumpster and Danny sees something white come out of the dumpster, and it is a black bear carrying a bag of used diapers in its mouth. And it runs in front of the car, right? So we got to see, A, we got to see a bear. B, it was a bear that was about to dine on used diapers. And C, it was by this crazy landmark that, you know, we had gone a little out of our way to just see, is that place still there? And not only was it still there, it was even wonkier than it was last time we'd been through there.
And you, sir, have the opening scene for the next installment in the 2000 Maniacs saga.
There you go, right there, you know. But, you know, I driving home from the Triple Bill at the Twin City Drive-In in 1972, Last House on the Left, Twitch of the Death Nerve, Mark of the Devil, in that order, right? I mean, talk about three movies to go home and take a shower after by. Those three are them. On my way home on Route 2 between Montpelier and Waterbury, Vermont, fog rolled in, got really hard to see on the road. Part of why I got off the highway and went on Route 2 is if I don't have good visibility, I at least want to be in a road where somebody's not going to be speeding. There's suddenly a cow in front of me on the road. In fact, there were more than one cows on the road in front of me. I had to stop my car. I had to get out. I had to coax the cows off the road to continue my drive home. And, you know, that was a memorable drive home after three really intense, very off the deep end horror movies from 1972.
Of all the things you expected to experience that night, herding
that
was
wasn't
probably
it.
not one.
Right, herding cows was not high on my list. So, but yeah, I mean, that's my last favorite drive-in memory was going out with Danny a whole night, you know, 4-hour drive to see one movie, but that was and it was a worthwhile movie to see at a drive-in. It was a perfect film to see at a drive-in. And it was that very weekend when it was the #1 film in America, because that's when no one was going to theaters was closed, and that title landed on #1, and everybody was going, what is this, right? And we saw it that weekend. How perfect is that?
You helped make it #1.
It helped make it #1.
The pandemic was really interesting for drive-in owners. We were like one of the only things to do, period, in the region where we operated. So, and it was a safe way for people to get out, and people came up to us. We had the snack bar closed, and we had like an order window at one set of doors and a pickup at the other, and had all the protocols in place. And people were thanking us. They were saying, I haven't left my house in a month, and thank you for being a reason. People hadn't gone out to drive-ins, people who hadn't ever been or hadn't been out in decades. And because everybody, again, you're in your own little pod and you're separated, and it was really the perfect pandemic entertainment.
It is. I was hoping it would lead to a blossoming of drive-ins, but it hasn't up here. I mean, I should state for the record, if I didn't mention it earlier, there are still, I believe, 3 drive-ins in rough driving distance for us, including the Fairleigh Drive-In in Fairleigh, Vermont, where there's a motel that has rooms where you can rent the room and watch out of your picture window.
I was going to bring that up.
That said, we had friends who, as an anniversary gift, were given by friends, not by us, were given by friends of theirs, already prepaid trip to the Fairleigh Motel and Drive-In. They were so excited. They got their room and a van parked right in front of their window. They did not get to experience the movie from their Fairleigh Motel.
Wow.
Room. And we were flabbergasted. Like, you would think the motel would have had that covered, right? Like, long ago.
I've been there and I don't remember. I guess you could probably park anywhere, but my memory is that the parking for cars was much closer to the screen, and they had like a little converted little school bus for the snack bar in the back. But I've never experienced the rooms.
Yeah, well, whatever they did, our friends were not happy about that, because they had driven up quite a ways from where they live in Massachusetts to enjoy that free Fairleigh driving experience, and it turned out to be not a driving experience.
Fairleigh is one that I discovered late in my time that I still lived in New Hampshire. I was going to college and coming back in the summers, and it was a drive-in that was within driving distance, because I had been going to Northfield and everything down there, and now suddenly I found out that there was one so close. And at the time, I remember seeing 2 unusual movies for a drive-in. It was Vermont is for Lovers, and another might have been Man with a Plan. Actually.
Oh, those are both John O'Brien films. Those are the same filmmaker, right?
Okay, that makes sense. They were 2 very Vermont-centric indie films. And then after that, they were, at the time, they were always movies that were a week or so away from hitting video. They were very, very second or third run films at the time. I don't know if they're getting more.
Oh, they've changed that. They've changed that. Although I've never been to the Fairleigh Drive-In. I mean, the only time they ever had a double bill I was even vaguely tempted to go to was Jurassic Park and the Flintstones. You know, great double bill, but I own Jurassic Park, and you couldn't pay me to go see the Flintstones again, so I opted to stay home. There's also a family-owned drive-in, the Bethel Drive-In up in Bethel, Vermont, and that apparently is a small home run operation. They almost went under, but they were able to manage enough fundraising because, you know, all the theaters, you guys know this at the Pennsylvania Drive-In, they have to convert to digital. And that was an incredibly expensive process. I've been going through all these back issues of Box Office magazine, and I don't know if the material I've started mailing to you has begun to arrive yet. But
not yet as of this recording.
Okay, so I've been photocopying for you material specific to the Pennsylvania drive-ins. And, you know, we forget that those drive-ins that survived the 40s had to go through probably 3 to 4 phases of equipment improvement, you know, having to replace projectors and projection equipment because they had to adapt to multiple widescreen formats, multiple changes in sound systems. And once you get into the next decade with the 60s and early 70s, the conversion from speakers to radio, there's always these upgrades that have to happen that are prohibitively expensive. And those, I'm certain, had to be factors in the phasing out of drive-ins. The other big one being when land became more valuable without a drive-in on it than, you know, being open pasture that was valuable as a drive-in because it was only going to be mowed land if there weren't a drive-in there.
Well, the fate of the Claremont Drive-In that I used to go to is that it originally was on the outskirts of town. It was in a rural area, but as commercial development went out and out and out, it basically was right up next to a commercial parking lot with a shopping plaza, and it then fell victim to that and became an extension of that shopping plaza.
That's what happened to the Twin City Drive-In. It's now an RV sale lot because what the growth of retail on the Barry Montpelier Road, you know, grew to its location. And I know the same is what happened to at least 3 of the Burlington area drive-ins I used to go to. Others, the St. Albans Drive-In, the screen has collapsed. But for years, I would drive up there after they closed and, watch the gradual decay of this beautiful giant screen that was visible from a couple of the roadways. And now it's just gone.
And what's actually makes the Mahoning unique is that we never did upgrade to digital. That was part of the decision to try to differentiate ourselves at the time, when it was drop $100,000 that we didn't have for digital and still play the same movies as everybody else, or stick with 35 and play old stuff. And it was a gamble and it was a slow build, but now it's, we're pretty well known for that. And if you look at our screen, as you said, the changes over time. When it opened in 49, it was a 4:3 Academy ratio. That's what the shape that movies were, more like a square.
Right.
And at some point, I found the ads when it announced it was now a CinemaScope screen. And we've got that full wide CinemaScope screen. And if you look, you can sort of see where the additional construction,
where the panels went, right.
The wings, so to speak.
And in places like Pennsylvania, where you are, among the articles I sent you, Mark, which you can talk about or share with your listeners, Pennsylvania, like Vermont, used to have blue laws where the drive-ins couldn't operate on Sundays, right? A lot of conservative states, and Vermont and Pennsylvania, conservative states, the blue laws, I sent you clippings of the court battles that went on over changing the blue laws. And even there, it's this transition period where, and it's fascinating to me to look back at the history. It's like, once the blue laws are changed so that movies can be shown at a Sunday, then the conversation becomes what movies are appropriate to show on a Sunday. And then about 2 years later, you'll see a little blurb in the trades about, this drive-in in this area now makes a little bit of money on the side by allowing Sunday masses during the daytime at the drive-in. And you can see how the drive-in went from being a Sunday pariah that the blue laws were sheltering people from, to becoming an alternative place for people to gather and worship. And I find that fascinating. It's like, okay, there's the 1950s shift in what the drive-in experience became in a lot of these rural communities. Also, the argument over, do you close down in the winter or do you stay open? And, you would have theater owners like Robert L. Lippert, who also was a film producer, but he owned a lot of theaters. And his argument was, you're losing money if you close.
Right.
And, I don't know about you, but I sure wonder when I see those old newspaper ads for in-car heaters. How would that work? Where could I put it where it wouldn't melt my glove box? And then I remember cars weren't all made of plastic back then. I'm sure there were little in-car heaters that worked just fine.
I've talked to a friend of mine who lives in Ohio, and he has theaters that stay open year round out there. And I said, well, what do you do in the winter? He said, you just run your engine. Now, with gas costs, I don't know if you really want to burn half a tank of gas to watch a movie in addition to your film fees, but I've always been envious of people who have drive-ins that are open year round, where the temperature and the climate is a little bit more amenable to that.
Yeah, but that also is different. Like, how did that work when you had to hang a speaker from a window?
Oh, yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
You couldn't close all the windows. I mean, we're thinking now, 21st century, radio sound. Well,
True.
That's not how sound was available to you. And those drive-in speakers, I've got one nostalgically placed in my viewing room.
Same here.
I have never hooked it up to listen to, because the quality of sound in those speakers is atrocious.
I remember that. I remember as a kid hanging them on the window and being really afraid it was going to scratch the window, because it was this big heavy hunk of metal.
Oh yeah.
Tarnished metal you were hanging on that window. So be gingerly with that. My mother remembers somebody driving out at the end of a night and not detaching the speaker and losing a side window. Yeah. I remember that happening as well. So, I'd go again. I mean, I wish I lived closer to where you are in Pennsylvania. My son has talked about, hey, Dad, maybe we should take the pilgrimage out there. So if you find some weekend where there's something you really want to see, there are little hotels nearby. We let people sleep on the lot too. It's roughing it, especially when it's colder.
I turned 67 in March. Hopefully I can save my sleeping in car days for when I can no longer afford a nursing home. But
that's what I say too. It's like, I think a lot of us cross a certain time in our life where it's like, a shower's nice. I enjoy a pillow now and again.
It's not just that. I also, and I'm not bragging. I have a viewing room. I saved up money. My wife gave me her blessing when we moved that one room would become. And I've got, I can watch any drive-in movie I ever wanted to see in better condition than it was ever available to me when I saw it brand new, including, you know, proper widescreen transfer, subtitles, perfect sound. But you know, that is a pilgrimage I would love to take, because as you said at the outset, I mean, I don't think I missed a single one of those Colonial showings that you sponsored.
Those were so much fun.
Those were so great. I mean, Dr. Fives, Brides of Dracula. I remember taking, you know, my son and his gal to see Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. I never thought I'd ever get to see that on a big screen, much less to see it on the big screen with a couple people in their 20s. It's like, holy shit, that was great. And I'll never forget how great King Kong versus Godzilla was on the screen, the original.
That was the one against which we measured everything else. That it was only downhill from there, because it was a brand new print that Universal, they had just had a vault fire and they just struck that print for us. It was, we advertised it all over New England, and it was like a line down the block. We did really
It was
well.
the perfect movie. I mean, there aren't that many films from that era that hit all those sweet spots. Giant monsters, family movie, wrestling families could enjoy it because it's basically a wrestling movie, right? With two guys in rubber suits. And the audience was totally into what you guys were doing with the horror host and the giveaways at the halfway point and everything. It was just a perfect afternoon at the movies.
Selfishly, it was me trying to create the kind of thing that we never got to experience when they happened the first time around. So we were picking movies that we thought other people would want to see. It's what we do at the Mahoning too.
Yeah, but you never know. Like, I thought Killer Clowns would pack the house again. You guys showed Killer Clowns from Outer Space, and it just, you know, there's cult and there's cult.
We might have been a little ahead of the curve on that. We've shown that at the Mahoning, and it does really well. I think that's gained in more recent years.
But you've also cultivated an audience at the Mahoning that's very different from what the Colonial Theater cultivated in Keene.
Exactly.
You guys were swimming upstream in a stream that was not conducive to the kind of film culture you were looking to cultivate. And, you know, I've been showing 16 millimeter films since I was in high school. I was one of those weird kids that I got myself voted onto student council because I realized there was money that nobody was using to rent films and show them publicly. So I began showing 16 millimeter publicly at our high school auditorium by the time I was in 9th grade. And right up to when I retired from teaching in 2020, I was still doing movie nights almost every week for the students. And you never know, you never know what people are going to come to, and you never know what you're up against. And what you've cultivated there in Pennsylvania, where people will come a long distance to experience what you're offering, you're nurturing a kind of film culture that just didn't take in Keene for some reason. And you would think with the college there it would have, but I've had students who sat me down and patiently explained to me why video games are better than cinema. And sorry, that is not an argument I'm even going to engage in, because I made my decision long ago in this lifetime of what was important to me. And cinema trumps just about everything except life and family, so.
it is our passion,
It is. That's why we're talking here now.
It's my favorite thing. Well, I want to thank you for joining us on the podcast.
My great pleasure. Sorry I went on so long.
I think I'd like to have you back in the future to talk about some other topics, because I think we could go all day with this, but what I think the average listener or viewer, they drop off at about the 3 or 4 hour mark and how much they want to see two other guys talk about something. So.
Well, we're up to the 91-minute mark. So I'll just mention, because self-promotion is
please, anything that you have coming up.
I have been doing, as you mentioned at the outset, bonus features and commentary tracks for Blu-rays and box sets. And most recently, the ones I've done that have already been announced and I can talk about is I did a bonus feature on Bigfoot movies for the Severin release of Night of the Demon, the 1981 Bigfoot splatter movie, not to be confused with the Jacques Tournier 1957 Night of the Demon, aka Curse of the Demon. Fritz the Cat, I got to do a commentary track with my very dear friend G. Michael Dobbs, who used to edit Animato magazine and Animation Planet. The two of us sat down and did a track for Fritz the Cat. Very proud of that. That's out on the Kino Lorber / Scorpion releasing label. I think I can mention this. I just did one of 2 commentary tracks for releases that are coming out from a label called Deaf Crocodile. They have licensed a number of the 1950s Russian heroic fantasy / fairy tale films. And I delivered the track for the film that was released in America as The Sword and the Dragon from 1956, a terrific Russian heroic fantasy film. And I'm doing a second one that I can't say the title because I haven't announced it yet. And I'm about to do two of my favorites, one of which I originally saw at a drive-in. For Arrow, I'm doing Return of Count Yorga.
Excellent.
And I'm very proud that I am the companion track. My great friend Tim Lucas did the commentary track for Count Yorga Vampires. So those will be together.
Beautiful.
And the British novelist Stephen Laws and I are doing the commentary track for the Dunwich Horror from 1970, the adaptation that Daniel Haller directed for producer Roger Corman. And I got more that I've been doing that they haven't announced yet, so I'll butt my lip beyond that. And I've also got a second volume of Cryptid Cinema that'll be out later this year, entirely dedicated to one of the great drive-in movies, Legend of Boggy Creek.
I'm speaking with Pam Barslow tomorrow on this.
Oh, please tell Pam I send my love. And the restoration job that Pam did, I mean, she rescued her father's movie, and it is a pristine Blu-ray. And, you know, I see people online like, oh, it costs too much, or I'll wait till it's on sale. It's like, no, this is the daughter of the filmmaker, right? Drop the 20 to 30 bucks, support the family that made the movie. It is a beautiful restoration, and she paid out of pocket for every step of that. So shut the fuck up. Lay down your 310s, buy the movie. It is terrific. And that's the kind of release that I'm particularly supportive of. So, yeah, that's great. I'm glad you're going to be talking to
Pamela. Oh, yeah. Anytime I can pay the creator directly, the artist directly.
I'm there.
When I have friends who I know do things, books, music, whatever, I always contact them separately. And I say, what way can I buy this where you get the majority of that money?
Exactly. So support them. You know, the same people that I saw bitching about that are the people that I'll see post on Facebook that they just paid 75 bucks for the Blu-ray release they missed 5 years ago of some low budget movie nobody gives a rat's ass about. And, you know, it's like, come on, when it's available, when it's in reach, buy it now, because a year, 2 years from now, anything can happen. You know, all this stuff is going to go away.
Especially with these cult films that we like, there's no guarantee they're going to see the light of day again physically.
Exactly. So support these releases. We are in a real golden age of access to the kind of films you and I love. And I feel so fortunate to have lived long enough to enjoy some of these harvests. Nobody can afford all of them.
So what's it like? So I was watching the Sam Katzman collection Arrow video the other day, and I think I was aware that you were involved, but I pop on the extra and here's a feature-length lecture with my close personal friend, legendary comic artist S.R. Bissette, talking about, I just love to say that.
That's
talking
great.
about the films of Sam Katzman, and it was fantastic. And all the visual imagery you use, we have a pretty big TV here, so it was glorious to be able to just freeze frame and look at old ad mats and cell sheets.
And that's all stuff I scanned out of my collection and sent them, it was part of the PowerPoint that I presented as well. I love doing those kind of presentations. I'm also on the Weird Wisconsin set, the films of Bill Rebane. I love doing that kind of stuff, in part because these are histories that are, you know, these are fascinating histories because individuals made these crazy things. You know, teams of people made these crazy movies. And the stories behind how these things not only came to exist, but how did they get out there? Like, how did people even see this stuff? The Katzman one was fun to do, but the Bill Rebane was even more fun because they asked me at Arrow to do that because I had contributed as an expert, quote unquote, on regional filmmaking. When they did, Stephen Thrower curated the American Horror Project Volume 2, and they had a movie that had been made in Vermont, Dark August from 1976. And I did a bonus lecture for that about Vermont filmmaking, independent Vermont filmmaking. That led to them, when they were doing Weird Wisconsin, maybe Steve Bissette knows about Bill Rebane. I'm of the generation that saw Bill Rebane's films as they came out in whatever platform or venue they were available on. I saw 2 of them in theaters. I saw 3 of them when they were direct to video. I it's like Bill was shifting his mode to whatever was going to allow him to make enough money to make another movie and try to recoup his investment on whatever the current film was that he was out there schlepping. And that covers 3 phases of exploitation film history, 4 in technically. I love that stuff. And there's so much misinformation out there on the internet. And part of why I love doing these bonus features is here in my collection, I have a lot of original source materials, press books, stills, but also back issues of trade magazines from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. That's where the history is. And if you're dependent just on what you can Google, you're going to find a lot of errors out there. And if you take them at face value,
you're perpetrating the myths. Yeah.
Well, we've lost a piece of film history. The Russian film I just did the commentary track for was released here as The Sword and the Dragon. If you go to Wikipedia, it says The Sword and the Dragon was a Roger Corman pickup. Corman had nothing to do with it. It was not at any point in its history handled by Roger Corman. And if you're a Mystery Science Theater 3000 fan, they riffed on The Sword and the Dragon, and they made fun of the fact it was made in Finland. It wasn't made in Finland. It's a Russian movie. They were bouncing off the fact they had riffed on The Day the Earth Froze, which was a Russian-Finnish co-production, but it was the only one of those. And as I dug into the history, and I'll leave you with this, Mark, the 2 men who bought The Sword and the Dragon and released it in America were a man named John Harris and Sig Shore, S-I-G Shore. John Harris was the father of James Harris, who was the partner of Stanley Kubrick. James Harris produced The Killing, Paths of Glory, Lolita. And in one of the Variety articles I found, and it's the only evidence we found for this, John Harris claimed his son and his son's partner were handling the dubbing of The Sword and the Dragon. Does that mean Stanley Kubrick put a week or 2 into this movie? There's no evidence of it anywhere else. But if you dig back into original source materials, those are the little nuggets of gold that we live for.
That's fantastic.
Anyway, thanks for having me on, Mark. This has been a blast.
Steve Bissette, thank you so much. Thank you all for listening to this episode of Mahoning Drive-In Radio. We will hear you. You will hear us. Somebody will hear somebody again next week. And until then, we will see you at the drive-in.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks again for coming out tonight to the Mahoning Drive-In Theater. We hope you'll come back and see us again real soon. The exit is on the right-hand side of the screen at the front of the field. And most importantly, have a very safe trip home. Good night and God bless you.